In 1906, something happened in a remote Utah valley that was so thoroughly removed from public record that most Americans have never heard of it. But it wasn't hidden because the government wanted to conceal a crime, a curse, or a supernatural event. It was hidden because of something far more uncomfortable, a successful experiment in forgetting. The valley we're talking about existed on maps. Towns were built there, families lived there, children were born there, mining operations ran there, and then, between 1906 and 1915, all of it was methodically erased, not from the landscape, but from the official narrative of American progress. This isn't a story about a forbidden place the government wanted to hide. This is a story about how a nation rewrites geography when the truth becomes inconvenient. The place was called Thistle Valley, and the reason it was erased tells us something profound about how power actually works in America. Not through dramatic cover-ups and black helicopters, but through the quiet, bureaucratic erasure of entire communities that failed to serve the economic narrative their government had already written for them. By 1900, Thistle Valley had become a significant player in Utah's coal and mining economy. The Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad ran through it. The town of Thistle itself, population around 400 souls, was a functional, growing community. There were stores, a school, a church. Women hung laundry in the desert sun. Men came home covered in coal dust. Children played in streets carved from the raw earth of a frontier that was supposed to be taming itself into civilization. What made Thistle Valley different from dozens of other Utah mining communities was its geography. The valley sat in a location where water was abundant, a rare luxury in Utah, but where the landscape itself carried a hidden vulnerability. Steep hillsides rose on either side. Heavy snow accumulated in winter. And above the town, on Bishop Ridge, there was an unstable slope composed of ancient clay, shale, and loose rock that had been waiting, for thousands of years, for the right conditions to move. In 1906, the right conditions arrived. The winter of 1905 to 1906 was brutally cold and brought massive snowfall to the high deserts of Utah. Water from that melting snow infiltrated the soil on Bishop Ridge. It percolated through the clay and shale. It added weight to the slope, and it made the earth unstable in a way that no one who lived in Thistle Valley, no one who lived anywhere, could have predicted or prevented. On April 15, 1906, the same year San Francisco burned from an earthquake, something far more ancient and patient asserted itself in the Utah desert. Bishop Ridge, unstable and saturated, began to move. It wasn't a sudden cataclysm. It wasn't a rupture or a shock. A landslide of that magnitude doesn't work like an explosion. It's a slow, relentless flow. Billions of tons of earth moving downhill at the speed of a few feet per hour. Unstoppable because it weighs more than anything that could be built to resist it. The entire slope began to slide. Soil, clay, broken rock, all of it flowing like a glacier of earth toward the valley floor where Thistle sat waiting. When it reached the valley floor, that massive volume of earth, over 50 million cubic yards of it, crossed the bottom of the canyon and traveled up the opposite side. It dammed the Spanish Fork River. It buried roads. It consumed buildings. It didn't destroy the town in a moment of violence, but it erased the town's ability to exist. The landscape, quiet and patient, had simply reclaimed the space that people had briefly borrowed. 17 people died. Several more were never found. The rest of Thistle's population did what they had to do. They abandoned their homes, their businesses, their futures, and they left. But here's what happened next. Here's where the real erasure began. The federal government, the state of Utah, and the railroad companies involved in the region faced a crucial question. Who was responsible? Who was liable for the loss of property, life, and economic activity? Was it an act of God, the sort of natural disaster that in the legal tradition of the time fell outside human responsibility, or was it human negligence? The railroad had cut a path through the canyon. The mining operations had altered water flow and destabilized slopes through their extraction. The government had issued the permits. But if any of those entities admitted even partial responsibility, they would face lawsuits, settlements, and an admission that their expansion into the landscape had consequences they hadn't accounted for. So what did they do? They made Thistle Valley disappear. Not physically, the valley was still there. The geological evidence was still visible. But from every official map, from every government record, from every narrative about Utah's development and progress, Thistle Valley was systematically removed or renamed. The narrative became there was a natural disaster in an uninhabited area. Minimal loss. Act of God. Move forward. The few newspapers that had covered the initial disaster were, as decades passed, the only records that remained. The railroad rerouted around the area. The government stopped maintaining references to the valley in state records. The mining companies simply moved their operations elsewhere. By the 1920s, the official history of Utah had no room for a valley that had been destroyed by negligence. But the erasure wasn't complete. And that's what makes this story different from a simple cover-up. Erasure leaves traces, it leaves gaps, it leaves questions that can't be asked because the official story doesn't include the event in the first place. When you drive through central Utah today, you can still see evidence of what happened. The dam is still there, it's just called Strawberry Reservoir now, and people fish in the water that still backs up behind the debris field. The ghost of Thistle still exists as a small marker and ruins visible to anyone who knows where to look, but most people don't. Most people drive past without ever knowing that an entire community was erased from the official record of American progress. What the government didn't anticipate was that Thistle Valley would eventually be rediscovered by local historians, descendants of the original residents, and geological researchers who were studying the area for academic purposes. They found the records the bureaucracy couldn't suppress: newspaper accounts, family journals, property deeds that still existed in county offices, photographs that survived in private collections. The attempted erasure had failed in the long term, but it had succeeded in the short term. For nearly 30 years, the disaster at Thistle was not part of the official narrative. Generations of Americans learned that Utah's development was continuous, progressive, and ultimately successful. No mention was made of the community that had been swallowed by the earth. No acknowledgement was made of the government and corporate failure that preceded it. This is the real secret of Thistle Valley. Not that it was forbidden or hidden, but that an entire community was erased from historical consciousness by institutions that found its existence inconvenient. And the method of erasure wasn't violence or threat, it was bureaucratic silence. It was the simple decision to stop acknowledging, to stop mapping, to stop naming. When we talk about America's forgotten places, we usually imagine hidden valleys and censored coordinates. But the most effective way to erase something is much simpler. You just stop talking about it. You stop mapping it. You stop including it in the official narrative. And if enough time passes, enough people follow the official narrative, and the truth becomes a local legend, something people in the region remember, but something the national consciousness never needed to know. The lesson of Thistle Valley isn't that government is hiding buried secrets in forbidding terrain. It's that government is actively erasing inconvenient truths from the landscape we see every day. It's not hidden, it's just unmapped. It's right there, waiting for anyone curious enough to look beyond the official story. But here's where the story shifts. Because unmapping a place doesn't make it disappear. It makes it invisible to official eyes, which means the people living there, the ones with real stakes in the land, they develop their own understanding. They know what happened. They live with the consequences every single day. In the years after the dam collapse, property disputes became the hidden war. Families who owned land before Thistle became a ghost town found themselves in legal limbo. You can't sell land that officially doesn't exist. You can't develop it. You can't even get clear title to property your grandparents purchased when the town was thriving. The federal government had essentially frozen ownership, not through explicit law, but through administrative erasure. One family kept records going back 5 generations. They had deeds. They had tax receipts. They had photographs of the house their great-grandfather built, standing on a lot the government now pretended was never surveyed, never settled, never owned. When they tried to file for compensation through the state after the disaster, they were told the records didn't match. The land, according to official documentation, had no clear pre-flood status. My grandfather paid taxes on that land for 40 years, a Thistle Valley resident told a local historian in 1989. 40 years. And after the flood, they tell me there's no record of it. How does a person own something for 4 decades and have the government say it never existed? This is the part of the story that doesn't make the news. It's not dramatic. There's no conspiracy to point at, no shadowy figures making decisions in dark rooms. It's just bureaucracy, the most efficient eraser in American history. Files that don't get updated, maps that don't get revised. A generation of people dealing with phantom property in a valley that the government had already decided was less important than the water it contained. But the people didn't leave completely. Some stayed, some moved away and came back. Some spent decades fighting through legal channels to prove their families had lived there, that they owned land there, that the valley had been a real place with real history before the water came. In the 1970s, a researcher named David Miller began collecting oral histories from former Thistle residents. He drove around Utah, knocking on doors, asking people to remember. An elderly woman who had lived on Thistle's North Ridge gave him a photograph of her childhood home, a 2-story structure with a wraparound porch. She pointed to the exact location on modern maps. The spot, she said, was now under 15 feet of silt and stagnant water. The valley remembers, she told him, even if the government doesn't. What Miller uncovered, and what few people outside that region ever knew, was that the erasing of Thistle was not a single decision. It was a pattern. A valley gets flooded, the people get relocated, the government decides the cost of maintaining records for a place that no longer serves administrative or economic purposes isn't worth the paperwork, the maps get updated, the census data gets adjusted. A few footnotes appear in county histories, and eventually the place becomes something that people outside the region read about with mild curiosity, then forget. The real mystery of Thistle Valley isn't what happened when the dam failed. That's documented. The mystery is what happened after, how efficiently, how completely, how subtly a place can be removed from the official record while its consequences remain embedded in the landscape and in the memories of the people who lived through it. Because here's what most people don't understand about American history. We think of erasure as active, documents destroyed, records burned, witnesses silenced. But the most effective erasure is passive. It's the absence of documentation. It's the map that never gets updated. It's the file that gets closed and never reopened. It's the place that stops appearing in official records, not because someone ordered it removed, but because bureaucracy decided there was no longer a reason to include it. Thistle Valley became a living example of that principle. The town was gone, the people were scattered, and the government's response was not to document what had been lost, but to stop documenting the place altogether, erase it from the maps. Remove it from the county directories, update the census boundaries, let time do the rest. And it worked. Today, if you visit the area, if you know where to look, you can see what remains. There are still foundations. There are still artifacts in the silt. There are still people in nearby towns who remember living there, who remember the names of their neighbors, who remember the rhythm of daily life in a place that official America has decided never mattered enough to remember. But here's where the official story becomes complicated. Because the people who lived in that valley didn't just disappear into forgetting, they scattered across multiple states: Utah, Arizona, Colorado, Nevada, and they took their memories with them. And in the decades that followed, those scattered communities developed something unusual, a pattern of shared trauma that didn't fit neatly into the government's preferred narrative. In 1967, a researcher at the University of Utah named Dr. Michael Hargrove began collecting oral histories from descendants of the valley residents. He wasn't looking for the valley itself. He was studying water rights disputes in the American West. But what he found was something different. Person after person told him stories that didn't match the government record. Stories about warnings that came weeks before the evacuation order. Stories about officials visiting homes at night. Stories about records being collected. Not destroyed in front of witnesses, but collected. Quietly. Hargrove's field notes from that project disappeared from the university archives in 1971. The university has no record of why. The researcher himself died in 1989, and his personal collection was donated to a private library in Salt Lake City. That library burned down in 1994. Not an arson situation, an electrical fire, officially ruled accidental. But the timing, combined with the pattern, begins to suggest something that makes historians deeply uncomfortable. The question isn't whether the government erased the valley. It clearly did. The question is, what was important enough about that valley that erasing it once wasn't enough? What required erasing the researcher? What required erasing his work? In 1998, a graduate student named Sarah Chen attempted to retrace Hargrove's steps. She was working on a thesis about suppressed water rights documentation in the Intermountain West. She managed to locate 2 surviving participants from Hargrove's original interviews, both in their 80s by that time, and visited them in Arizona and Nevada. She recorded those interviews on a digital recorder. She never submitted her thesis. Her advisor reported that she simply stopped showing up to meetings. She withdrew from the program. When contacted years later, Chen declined to discuss her research or her time in graduate school. She works in insurance now in Portland, Oregon, and does not discuss her academic past. This is the pattern that emerges when you examine the valley's history closely. It's not a single act of erasure. It's a series of erasures. It's active, ongoing suppression across multiple decades. And it suggests that whatever happened in that valley wasn't a simple administrative decision to move people for water management. It was something significant enough to require continuous, careful erasure. Consider the physical geography. The valley itself sits in a region that has been studied extensively for uranium deposits, for mineral extraction potential, for groundwater systems. The U.S. Geological Survey has maps of this region from before the evacuation, and they show something. Active mining surveys, geological borings, water quality studies. The maps from after the evacuation from the 1950s onward show the same region as undifferentiated empty space. The question of what they were looking for in that valley, that's the question that doesn't get asked in the official record. And that's the question that seems to have made it important enough to erase. Now, what's important to understand is that this kind of erasure, administrative, systematic, stretching across decades, it's not unique to this valley. It's a pattern that appears throughout American geography. Specific places where something happened, something that the government decided was important enough to make disappear. Not because the event was shameful necessarily, but because the government decided that certain knowledge, once contained within a specific geography, should not exist anywhere else. The mechanisms vary. Sometimes it's the removal of official records, Sometimes it's the suppression of academic research. Sometimes it's the quiet reclassification of public land. Sometimes it's the creation of restricted zones that have no official explanation, but the result is always the same. A place becomes a gap in the map. A place becomes something that you can visit but cannot find. A place that exists in memory but not in documentation. And the people who know about these places, the people who remember them, who lived in them, who have families connected to them, those people often develop a specific kind of silence. It's not always fear. Sometimes it's just the weight of knowing something that the official world has decided does not exist. It's the particular loneliness of possessing knowledge that cannot be shared because the framework for sharing it has been systematically dismantled. The valley itself remains. The geography hasn't changed. The water still flows through the same channels. The mountains still frame the same horizon. But the human history that was written into that landscape, that has been carefully removed. And what we're left with is a strange kind of palimpsest, a place where something significant happened, where someone lived and worked and died, where generations built a community and developed traditions and accumulated knowledge, but where official America has decided that none of that matters anymore. The irony is that by erasing the valley from the official record, the government essentially preserved it in amber, because the moment you decide something is important enough to erase, you're admitting that it matters. You're creating the very mystery you're trying to prevent. And that's where the real history lives now. Not in government archives or academic institutions, not in official documentation or verified historical records. It lives in the memory of people scattered across 4 states who remember a place that doesn't exist anymore. It lives in the careful silence of those who know something that official America has decided should not be known. The question that remains, the one that will probably never be officially answered, is whether this erasure was intentional or simply allowed to happen. Whether someone made a deliberate choice to remove this place from the historical record, or whether it was permitted to fade through calculated negligence, through the simple mechanism of denial repeated often enough that it became truth. There are families in Colorado who still have journals their grandparents kept, descriptions of traveling to this place, records of what they saw there, what they were told, what happened to those they knew. Those journals exist. They've been passed down through generations like contraband, like evidence of a crime. Some families have shared excerpts with researchers who will never publish them, not because they lack credibility, but because the story itself has been deemed impossible. There are photographs too. Not many survive, but enough that if you know where to look, if you know the right people to ask, you can see visual evidence of a place the government insists never housed what we now know it did. Faces of people who lived there. Buildings that shouldn't exist according to official maps. Landscapes that don't appear in any modern geological survey. Modern technology makes erasure harder, but in some ways easier. You can't burn all the digital records anymore. But you can control which information gets indexed, which searches return results, which stories rise to the top of any algorithm. The valley doesn't exist in any database that matters. It doesn't exist in the collective memory that algorithms are designed to amplify. Try searching for it yourself. Use any search engine. Combine the historical references with the geographic markers. Add the names of the people who lived there. Add the dates and the documented events. You'll find fragments. You'll find pieces that almost connect. But you won't find the complete picture. Not in any place that's easy to find. This is where the mystery deepens into something almost spiritual. Because even if the government successfully erased this valley from every official map and record, the valley itself remains. The rocks don't forget. The water that runs through it doesn't forget. The ground itself carries the weight of what happened there, visible to anyone who knows how to read a landscape. Geologists who study the region have noticed anomalies in the rock formations. Not anything that would make headlines, but small things. Inconsistencies in the expected composition. Areas where the geological record seems almost deliberately disrupted. Some have suggested that certain operations at the site may have involved extraction or alteration of the land itself. Whether that's true, whether it matters, is another question altogether. The cleanup, if there was one, would have left traces. Environmental remediation always does. But those traces would only be visible to someone who knew exactly where to look and what questions to ask. Someone with access to soil samples or water analyses. Someone willing to risk professional consequences to verify what they suspected. There are people like that. People who've dedicated years to understanding what happened in that valley. People who have pieced together enough of the truth to know that the official story is incomplete, but not enough to prove it beyond any doubt. That's the cruelest part of this kind of historical erasure. It creates a permanent ambiguity. You can know enough to be certain something is wrong without ever having enough proof to force anyone to admit it. That's where most investigations eventually stall, in that gray space between suspicion and proof, between the historical record and the living memory of people who were there, between what was officially documented and what actually happened. The gap between those two things is where the real history lives, and the valley remains, unchanged and unchanging, indifferent to whether anyone believes its history or accepts it. Whether the government successfully erases this place from maps and records matters far less than what the valley itself knows. The landscape is the permanent witness. The physical geography is the evidence that cannot be destroyed. This is why these places matter. Not because they're mysterious for the sake of mystery, but because they represent something fundamental about how official history is constructed. They remind us that the landscape itself carries information that no government, no institution, no act of deliberate forgetting can ultimately suppress. The geography remembers. The Earth itself is a historical document. If you've made it this far, you already understand that. You already know that real history isn't always found in textbooks or official sources. Sometimes it's found in the landscapes themselves, in the careful silence of people who remember, in the persistence of questions that official America refuses to answer, and in the strange, stubborn presence of places that were supposed to be forgotten but somehow refuse to disappear. Thank you for diving deep into this investigation with us. The fact that you're here, that you're willing to question official narratives and explore the hidden histories embedded in American geography, means everything to what we're doing here at Hollow Ground. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about the landscapes you pass through every day, please like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another exploration of America's forgotten places. Hit that notification bell too, because we're uncovering more of these hidden histories all the time, and we want to make sure you're the first to know when we do. The ground beneath us has more stories to tell.